International Media TV. Television that listens to you.
Hi, I'm Johnnie Burrell. Welcome to the program.
Just want to read you a quote. I'm going to read you two quotes. The first one his quote is, "We wish to plead our own cause. Too long have others spoken for us. For in the press and the pulpit we have suffered much by being incorrectly represented." This was a quote from the first African-American newspaper ever published in 1827. It was called Freedom's Journal. And the idea that this quote is still relevant today. I mean, we are harmed as people of color when we cannot speak for ourselves, when other people tell our stories, because when they tell our stories, they often get it wrong. And the problem historically has been that we don't have the ability to communicate to a mass audience. We don't own radio stations, we don't own TV stations. Only 3% of all TV stations in this country are owned by people of color, and 8% of radio stations. But ironically, back in 1827, back in the early 1800s, there were dozens, about 100 newspapers before the Civil War that were people of color actually published and printed at a time of oppressive discrimination. And the reason being, as we discuss in the book, is because U.S. postal policy, ironically, back then, heavily subsidized the delivery of mail. And that allowed people of color to actually have a voice, because the postal system was a decentralized system. It was a system where the voices of many could actually speak. But ever since then, whenever new technology has come along, it has fundamentally changed the media system. So whether it's the telegraph comes along, or radio comes along, or TV or cable TV, the system changes. And when the system changes, the government has a decision. Does it allow the greatest number of voices of people to actually participate and speak for themselves? Or does it turn over control to the hands of a few? And the story since the 1840s to the present day is corporate interest really pressuring government to turn over control of whatever media system is being born or that's emerging to the hands of a few.
Race has been central to the development of the media and has been a major theme of the news media. From the first newspaper, Public Occurrences, in 1690 in Boston, where the bulk of the copy was intelligence to the white settlers on what the savage Indians or skulking Indians were doing in and around the Massachusetts colony. And throughout the colonial period, a huge portion of the content of newspapers was information for the settlers about how to keep the natives of the Americas under control, and also about how to prevent, be warned of, or be wary of slave insurrections or violence by free blacks or enslaved blacks. Huge portion of the content. So race has been central to the content of the American media from the very beginning, and it's continued throughout the history of the country. The other thing that we discovered, and I call this the lurid scandal of American journalism, the number of examples that we uncovered, and we've got dozens of them in the book, where newspaper publishers or broadcast owners did not merely spread stereotypes, did not merely create ignorance on racial matters, but actively organized hostility, violence, pogroms, massacres, and riots geared at Native Americans, at the Chinese, at the Mexicans in the old Southwest Territory once it was incorporated from Mexico after the Mexican-American War, and against African Americans. And the stories are unbelievable, some of them. I've mentioned this in some of the Democracy Now! Interviews. The Wilmington coup, to me, is the most astounding. In 1898, there was the only successful armed coup in the United States in Wilmington, North Carolina, where a band of 2,000 whites, white supremacists, marched into the town of Wilmington. Wilmington still had a majority black city council. It was the tail end of Reconstruction. In November of 1898, they marched into town, burned down the only black newspaper in the town, rounded up all the black city councilmen and their few Republican allies at gunpoint, ordered them out of town, appointed a former Confederate colonel as the new mayor of Wilmington, and then proceeded to attack the black community in several days of armed violence that resulted in about 60 African Americans being killed. This was a successful armed coup led by the editor and publisher of the Raleigh Observer, Josephus Daniels. He used his paper to prepare for it by constantly claiming corruption and abuse of white citizens by the black city councilmen. He used his newspaper offices to plan the insurrection, and then he boasted afterwards of its success. Now, you'd say Josephus Daniels, maybe he's just some crazy Southern editor. Well, no, Josephus Daniels was one of the leading Southern editors of his time. He was an advisor to Woodrow Wilson. When Wilson becomes elected president, Wilson names him Secretary of the Navy. He ran our Navy during World War I. One of his assistants that he mentored was a young undersecretary named Franklin Delano Roosevelt. When FDR gets elected president, he names Josephus Daniels ambassador to Mexico. Josephus Daniels was a major political figure in this country who led a massacre, organized with his newspaper, a massacre, overthrew a locally elected government, and helped mastermind the murder of 60 people and was never held responsible for any of it. I mean, it wasn't until the 20th century, and it really wasn't until the 1970s, that the media in America was integrated. And we must understand that it was integrated not out of the goodness of the hearts of the publishers and the station owners. It was integrated because a mass civil rights movement forced open the doors. Between 1971 and 1973, there were 340 license challenges to the broadcast licenses of TV and radio stations in America. As all over the country, African Americans and Latinos walked into the stations and said, we're not going to take it anymore. We want you to cover our communities fairly. We demand that you put on shows to speak to our community. We demand that you hire people to report the news. And if you don't, we're going to Washington, we're going to challenge your license. And that's how the media began to change in America as a result of that huge community pressure. And that's when you started getting all of the first African Americans and Latinos into television, the Ed Bradleys and the Geraldo Riveras, and right here in San Francisco, Isabel Durón and others. They got in not because they were always qualified to do the reporting, but they were never given the opportunity until there was this huge civil rights movement that forced open the doors. So that's that's a story that needs to be understood and told, that the change can occur, but it usually occurs as a result of pressure, public pressure, community pressure. My favorite story, because I knew some of the people who were involved in 1972 when the public broadcasting system was really just developing after the Congress passed the public created the Corporation for Public Broadcasting. And 1972, a group of young Latinos who were fed up with the fact that PBS had been operating now for several years and there was no programming for Latinos, they all volunteered one day with Channel 13 in New York, WNET, to go in for the pledge drive. You've seen the pledge drive. And they all came in, and, in the old days, they would have all the people with the phones, answering the phones, getting the pledges in, they'd show them in the background. So all these Latinos volunteered one day to go and volunteer for the pledge drive. And in the middle of the pledge drive, they took over the station. And they walked away from the phones. They sat in the station. Channel 13 went black. The only time it's ever happened. It went black while they called in the police and hauled everybody out. And they arrested a bunch of people, several hundred people outside. But the result was that PBS created a national Latino show, which was called Realidades. And it operated for many years, and it was probably the best public broadcasting show about the Latino experience in America. But it also arose out of pressure, not because some executive made the decision that this had to be done, because they were forced to do it by the pressure to open up the media to more diverse voices. So this is all, the stories that we tell in the book about these community struggles, the journalists, and also the bigger picture, how does the system operate? The interesting thing that we discovered when we were looking at the story of Native Americans in journalism was not only about the amazing Native American press that developed in the country. Beginning in 1828, when Elias Boudinot founded the Cherokee Phoenix in Georgia, and several other papers that came out later on in the Indian country, when all the natives were removed to the west, in Shawnee and the Cherokee Advocate and a bunch of other newspapers. But it's also that several Native American journalists played key roles in what are commonly called Anglo Newspapers. One of them was John Rollin Ridge, who founded the Sacramento Bee, was the first editor and publisher of the Sacramento Bee, and who used the paper initially to not only do general news, he did all the general news of the day in Sacramento, but also to advocate against the continued attacks on the native populations of California. But about a year or so after he started the paper, he sold it to one of his employees, James McClatchy. And James McClatchy then took over the Sacramento Bee and built it into an empire, which became the McClatchy newspaper chain. But if you go to the website of the McClatchy newspaper, or you look at the official company histories, there's no mention that the flagship paper of the chain was started by a Native American writer.